All right, welcome everyone. We appreciate you joining us today. I'm Julia Fulghum, the Director of Advance at UNM, and I'm pleased to be co-hosting this event with Sonia Gipson Rankin, a faculty member at the School of Law, and many of you on main campus may know her from her time as Assistant Dean in University College. We're really pleased to be joined by a range of our colleagues today, Sever Bordeianu, who is Chair of Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee and faculty member in the College of Libraries, and three law school professors, Josh Kastenberg, John Kang, and Maryam Ahranjani. Before we jump right in, just a few announcements. We are recording this webinar. It will be posted on the Advanced Academic Freedom site. That site has links to the bios for all of our outstanding panelists. We are not giving legal advice today. So people are talking about their perspectives. This isn't legal advice, and we really encourage everyone to talk to your local leadership if you have questions about what to do in the context in which you are operating. Any references or citations that come up that aren't already on our page will be posted on our page shortly after this webinar. And we're doing this in collaboration with the School of Law, the Center for Teaching and Learning, and Academic Affairs. And we really appreciate all of our partners. And we're going to jump right in, starting with Sever telling us a little bit about the role of the Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee on campus.
Hello, everyone. I am the chair of the Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee. AF&T's purview is the academic freedom as defined by Section B of the Faculty Handbook. And I would like to share my screen. Let's see, I have it right here. And please tell me when you see it. Julia, can you see it?
Yes, you're in good shape.
Okay, so Section B of the Academic Freedom and Tenure Committee listed three core principles that comprise the purview of AF&T, and we call these the big three. A violation of academic freedom, improper consideration in which a decision on substantive issues was not based on impartial professional academic judgment and resulted in prejudice to the faculty member, or a procedural violation of faculty handbook policies that resulted in prejudice to the faculty member. And it continues with the definition of what academic freedom is. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because I know the other panelists will deal with that in a lot more detail. But I'm going to mention what the handbook says and what AF&T looks at when these issues come up. So first of all, it says academic freedom is defined in the 1940 Statement of Principles adopted by the AAUP and is the right of all members of the faculty and graduate students employed in teaching and research positions. I'm going to go to my next page, and this is Appendix 1 of the handbook. And obviously, you're not going to be able to read every single one of these words in the paragraphs, but Appendix 1 expands on that definition with more examples and very specific issues. So we have Appendix 1, A, teachers are entitled to full freedom in research and in the publication of the results, subject to the adequate performance of their other academic duties. But research for pecuniary return should be based upon the understanding with the authorities of the institutions. I'm not going to read each one of these in detail because I have other things that I'm going to cover. And of course, each person can actually read this for themselves. I do have links at the end of this document, so you can go directly to these documents from this particular slide. Teachers are entitled to freedom in the classroom in discussing their subject, but they should be careful not to introduce into their teaching controversial matter which has no relation to the subject. Point C says college or university teachers are citizens, members of a learned profession, and officers of an educational institution. When they speak or write as citizens, they should be free from institutional censorship or discipline. And it continues to explain how that is protected. We have two more points here. Point D says at the University of New Mexico, teachers recognize that they are responsible for the maintenance of appropriate standards of scholarship and teaching performance aimed at the goal of training the students to think for themselves. While the students have a right to know the teacher's point of view on relevant controversial subjects, the teacher has an obligation to set forth fairly and clearly the divergent opinions of other scholars so that the students may reach rational and independent conclusion. And the last one talks about cooperation. One thing that I want to point out that at the time of hiring, when a faculty person gets a contract, in the appointment letter, all these policies are referred to. So when a faculty person signs a contract for employment, they will be aware of these criteria. And I'm just quoting here from the template for the hiring template when faculty get hired. And this applies across the board from lecturers, assistant, associate, etc., professors. So this appointment will be annually renewable subject to the terms and conditions set forth in the University of New Mexico Faculty Handbook, which can be found at handbook.unm.edu. There's another document that I'd like to mention, which is C-150, which defines political activities at UNM faculty. And I'm just going to read just a very little bit from the very beginning, but it's very important for folks to read this and be aware of what the criteria are. So the University of New Mexico recognizes the right of free speech and expression of opinion on any subject by any member of the community, whether the subject relates to on or off-campus issues. UNM faculty members are citizens and are free to engage in political activities consistent with their obligations as teachers and scholars, subject to appropriate time, manner, and place restriction in accordance with applicable policies and laws. This policy document provides policies and procedures pertaining to the political activity of UNM faculty. And the next part of this, of course, I'm not going to read it. It provides the actual definitions of what is when a faculty person speaks on behalf of the university versus expressing their own political views and ideas. And what I have at the very end of this document is the policies from which I quoted with links to those policies. One thing that I would like to mention of chair of AF&T, I'm going to stop sharing right now so I can see everybody. AF&T really focuses on those three principles. And if a complaint falls outside of those three principles, academic freedom, improper consideration, and undue process, AF&T will refer to other entities on campus, starting with administration, EEOC, and other entities. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So with that in mind, I think we're really excited now to get into the meat of it. So to our colleagues online, I am so honored to introduce you to three of my friends. It would be one thing if these were just people at our university, but these are three of my friends. I cannot go on at length about how wonderful they are. They're going to change your lives just as they've done with mine. These are three of the wisest, most intentional, caring individuals that we have at the forefront. And they are faculty at this university who are experts in constitutional law. We are fortunate to have them on our own very campus, but you can also catch their research in the top journals across the nation, on international news, and on our own local news, being a resource to explain the law. But we didn't bring them here to explain the law today. We brought them here to have a conversation on professional and personal reflections on academic freedom. I'm going to introduce you briefly to my colleagues just by their name. Once again, their bios are astounding. We're going to hear from these three individuals. We'll start with Josh Kastenberg. Josh, you've got 5 minutes. Can you tell us a little bit, just in 5 minutes, and I'm going to watch the time on us, Josh, tell us a little bit about this academic freedom and where it even comes from.
Well, I'm trying to bring up my my slides, but I want to say this before I do bring up the PowerPoint slides, because you know what else is a PowerPoint discussion without it is this is an old concept. It dates back to 1915. It actually dates back a little bit before then. And I just have a couple of case studies I'd like to bring up. And thank you for the wonderful introduction. It's really an honor to be here among everybody today, especially the real experts, which I'm not. But fights about academic freedom are nothing new. In fact, I saw one when I was an undergrad at UCLA as a history undergrad, and one of my professors, I had Stanford Shaw, got his tenure, wrote a history of the Ottoman Empire and modern Turkey. That was a specialist. Someone bombed his house. But why did this happen, and why did the university seek to discipline him? Because after he got his tenure, he decided to make his life's avocation a denial of the Armenian genocide of 1915 and called it a hoax, and you know all sorts of other accusations that were ascholarly, meaning non-scholarly. Well, the first time in our history that I could see a lawsuit brewing up had to do with Professor James Cattell. His real name was James McKill Cattell, and Columbia University wanted to fire him from 1915 on, which they did. Nicholas Murray Butler, the president of Columbia University, who was a vice presidential candidate a couple of years earlier to William Howard Taft in a losing election, went after Cattell because Cattell spoke out against United States involvement in World War I. He was a strict neutrality type person. But the politics of this are nothing new. Members of the House of Representatives and the Senate called Nicholas Murray Butler in hearings before, demanded that Cattell be fired. The collection of Cattells at the Library of Congress has over 200 letters from angry legislators telling him they were going to ruin him. He was fired, but he turned around and sued Columbia University. He sued Columbia University successfully for a wrongful termination. During World War I, a number of professors are also fired, and these are in the AAU case files that are held by George Washington University. For some reason, GW got a hold of the case files, and you can see just a smattering. I'll concentrate a little bit on William Shaper in a minute briefly. All of these professors argued neutrality both on and off campus. They were considered unpatriotic. They were fired. Some of them got their jobs back, but most did not. The reason the AAUP came into being, however, before this occurred, has three case studies in particular. Richard Ely at the University of Wisconsin was a progressive. He argued that the power of railroads was taking over democracy in government, and he supported the strikers during the Pullman strike. He was fired. Edward Ross at Stanford really caused an affront to Mrs. Stanford, whose fortunes were made on the railroads. He advocated against Chinese immigration for the purpose of cheap labor, and he too was fired. And then John Spencer Bassett, who was a noted historian at Duke University, or its predecessor, argued to admit African-American men and for racial equality, and he also was fired, although he sort of had a happy ending as one of the nation's leading historians at Harvard and then Columbia later. The fights at that time, though, were over the power of industrial firms to appoint regents. And this is why I go back to William Shaper. Shaper, like most PhD holders, was either educated in Germany or born in Germany. In his case, it was both. He taught at the University of Minnesota, and beginning in 1914, he taught to his students as a history professor that Germany was no more culpable than Britain or France was for the outbreak of the war, and he advocated neutrality. This is one of the most interesting case studies at all. Pierce Butler was a regent of the university and a railroad attorney, and he went after Shaper with a vengeance. Shaper was fired. He tried to sue in the state courts. He got nowhere. 1922, President Warren G. Harding placed Pierce Butler on the United States Supreme Court. Butler became known to Washington, D.C., based on getting into the papers about being a muckraker of sorts at the university. And Shaper met a sad demise. He finished his life as a cloth salesman in Oklahoma, having been one of the leading European historians in the United States. And I bring this up just to show the political nature of it. On the other hand, and lawyers like economists like to say, on the other hand, once academic freedom was established, prior to the Supreme Court backing it, but once it was established through unions and state laws and the likes, the pendulum shows a great deal of tolerance for non-scholarly work. As an example, in the 1950s, Professor John Owen Beatty wrote this book called Iron Curtain Over America. It's got over 2,000 footnotes to it, but he argued that there was a well-known Jewish conspiracy dating to the Khazar Kingdom of 900 that was forever trying to overthrow Western civilization, and that included racial equality movements, the left, the New Deal, et cetera, et cetera. And if anyone thinks he was obscure, he ends up on Time magazine. He has senators backing him from being fired as SMU tried to do something to him. All SMU did is investigate him, ridicule his research, and he retired and died shortly thereafter. One of his biggest defenders was a columnist, an entertainment columnist named Hedda Hopper. I'm not a film historian, but it does strike me that this was well known. But why is it forgotten today?
Yeah.
It's forgotten today because of the law. The law is not perfect to protect academic freedom, but as Professor Kang will speak about the law, I'll just mention this briefly before I move on. In Keyshawn versus Board of Regents, the United States Supreme Court in 1967, for the first time, found that because the United States was deeply committed to safeguarding academic freedom, coupled with our First Amendment, that professors had to have protection, basically, that professor's speech and work was protected by the First Amendment. What really that case is about is you can't fire people who've been accused of communism or communist ties from campuses, but that is an incredibly strong case. And so the old case studies are forgotten about, but what I'd encourage our listeners to think about is the more things change, the more they stay the same. And the fights over academic freedom and the meaning of it, meaning is it a pure First Amendment issue, or is there a competency requirement and a behavioral requirement on us, the professors, part of what what defines what academic freedom is and is not. And one final note, what has changed is this. If any of us were living in 1920 and we said something to our class, it was hearsay by the time it was reported. But today we live in an age of social media. And as Douglas MacArthur once said, I'm not a fan of his, you're always on parade. And that, I'll end on that note, but
Thank you.
That's the reality we live in.
I want us to play here, Josh, and we're going to come back to this list. Thank you. Thank you. Now, here's the truth, Josh and John and Maryam. I have no plans to be a cloth salesperson. I want to be able to stay gainfully employed at this job. And we're getting ready to turn over to John. John, something I noticed, thank you again, Sever, for sharing the actual rules. We're lawyers. Oh, I always feel better with a set of rules. John, the rules said something about 1940, 1970, 1990. What is this thing of academic freedom, freedom of speech? I think people are getting these terms conflated, and we'd love for you to, in about 5 minutes, just share with us, what does all of this actually mean?
Thank you, Sonia. Freedom of speech and academic freedom has a certain amount of overlap, but conceptually, they're very different things. Your freedom of speech belongs to you as someone who lives in the United States, and it's a political right, most often justified as a means to persuade other people to go along with your particular political views. In other words, the freedom of speech is very much a democratic virtue, your citizenship in the United States. Academic freedom is the freedom you have as an employee of your university. It is the rights that you have as an employee as a vocational right rather than a political right. Now, a lot of times professors tend to confuse these two things, and I totally understand why. Professors by nature tend to be very outspoken people. They tend to have very strong opinions. They also, quite frankly, tend to be rather eccentric people who like to share their ideas with other people in sort of like a unfiltered way. I understand that. But they have to understand that academic freedom is not a political right. It's your right to do your job as an employee as part of a larger institution. And let me explain. Academic freedom encompasses 4 different areas, and I'm going to explain what they are. One has to do with teaching. One has to do with research. One has to do with faculty governance, and one has to do with speech outside of the university. With regard to teaching, this is your academic freedom as an employee of your university. You can discern what type of materials you want to provide your students, the type of pedagogy you want to choose, and how you want to assess your students. That said, this word freedom needs to be deeply qualified. You have the freedom to choose these things in terms of teaching, but you can't do whatever you want to, whatever teaching style you want to, whatever materials you want to, however you want to assess them. This is not your right as an employee of the university. There are certain common standards for which it's acceptable, and you can operate within that standard, but you can't operate completely out of that standard. With regard to research, it's the same thing. You have a great deal of academic freedom to write what you want to, but once again, you are operating as an employee within the university, and that is your freedom. You cannot write whatever you want to with the expectation that you will be granted tenure. You cannot write whatever you want to with the expectation that you will not be subject to some type of disciplinary hearing. For example, let's say you're a sociology professor. You want to know how drug dealers operate. You cannot yourself become a drug dealer in order to sort of acquire knowledge with regard to that. You want to know how hate speech affects your students. You cannot introduce hate speech in your classroom to see the reactions you get from your students. This is not part of your research. This is not part of your teaching. This is not part of your academic freedom. Faculty governance, you have the academic freedom as an employee of your university to engage robustly with regard to faculty governance. You do not, however, have the right to cause material disruption to the faculty meeting, to bring up topics which have nothing to do with faculty governance, to harass your colleagues. This is not part of your academic freedom. Lastly, and this is the most difficult thing to explain, academic freedom permits you to engage in speech outside of the university to express your political views. But once again, you have to be mindful with regard to what you say. The statement adopted by the AAUP says that you should remember that you are still an employee of the university, and professors, whether you want to or whether you don't want to, get to enjoy a certain amount of privilege in society. You tend to carry a certain amount of esteem. Try to be mindful as a matter of academic freedom. I would suggest to not bring undue controversy or undue shame to the university or your colleagues, the people who work with you, or your students. Part of the privilege of being a professor is that you get a certain amount of platform. The news media will talk with you, they want to interview you, but with that privilege comes a certain amount of responsibility that other Americans don't have. So I'll end with the following note. Your freedom of speech under the First Amendment entitles you to say a lot more things than your academic freedom as an employee of the university.
Thank you, John. John, I'm a little worried now. I'm looking on the wall here, colleagues. I won an award at the law school. It's called the Ice Cold Caller Award, most likely to cause students to freeze. Am I in some way violating my academic freedom? I'm a little worried. Have I harmed my students? I'm thinking about this list. I have control of materials and pedagogy and assessment. But Maryam, how does this actually impact the people who are going to be in my classroom and in the work I do? Could you share with us a little bit about our responsibility, our role, our relationship with students and your thoughts?
Sure. Thank you, Sonia. It's such a pleasure to be part of this discussion with my beloved colleagues and with all of you that are joining us. There are really 2 high-level points I hope to convey in my brief remarks. One echoes something that John was just getting to, which is really that we are in positions of, at our institution, public trust as faculty members in a public institution. And second, therefore, in my view, we ought to consider our right to academic freedom in tandem with the rights of students and the larger university. And we were invited to talk about professional and personal reflection. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how I've arrived at these points of view. You know, I teach First Amendment and other subjects that are constantly changing and that may involve a variety of viewpoints. that are bar tested, that are required for students to be prepared to activate in practice. And so, those things weigh in on my consideration of how and what to teach and what to write about. I'm also the child of immigrants, immigrants who came here from Iran in search of ideological, religious, and professional freedom. So I'm very well aware and grateful for that platform. On the other hand, I am acutely aware of being an outsider in many ways. I grew up during the Iran hostage crisis, during the Iran-Contra affair, and during the war between Iran and Iraq. All of that shaped how I developed my own voice and how I developed my own areas of interest. I have had the pleasure to live and work in Washington, D.C. and abroad for a couple of U.S. government agencies, which also shaped my view of how to use a unique platform with respect, and also respect both for the position and for the listeners and the recipients. And so I want to share with you some of the things that I've explored in my own teaching of education law in particular, and understanding of education law. So former Cornell University President Frank Rhodes described the benefits of academic freedom as an implicit quid pro quo arrangement whereby the public interest is served and strengthened by the autonomy given to universities. He observed that the effectiveness of the university has been dependent upon a social compact under which society supports the university financially and grants it a remarkable degree of autonomy, while the university uses its resources and its freedom to serve the larger public interest. Some of this was hinted at in the AAUP principles and other concepts we've talked about, cases that Josh presented to us. And in their textbook, one of the leading textbooks in higher education law, Alexander, and Alexander, who are related to one another, note 3 categories of academic freedom that have been recognized in the literature and also in legal disputes. And they include the academic freedom of students to obtain information, study, and obtain knowledge without mistreatment or abuse from professors. The second area category of academic freedom is the freedom of professors, which we've already discussed. And finally, it is a freedom for the university to shield itself from invasion by outside influences, whether it's a legislature, state or federal, or sometimes even the courts. So from my perspective, what I hope to share is just, again, this idea of our unique and trusted position as faculty members, as role models. So we don't operate in a silo, but as part of a large institution funded by our students and their hard-earned and their families' hard-earned dollars, and by other taxpayers. And so these freedoms, these 3 freedoms, may be in tension, and oftentimes they are. So again, I hope that we can think about this exercise of our own academic freedom as professors to speak and teach and write in the ways in which we can support and feel organic to us as individuals, but also understand that it is an art more than a science, our own exercise of it. And I'm excited about Sonia's activity for us next, which really points out some areas of potential tensions and how this idea of academic freedom really is an art. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start us off. So what we're going to do is work with John and Josh and Maryam on how they might respond to a very bad, no good, terrible day at the office. And we're going to start with a not quite so awful scenario, and then we're just going to devolve it. And if you have questions along the way related to this, please put them in the Q&A and we will try and work them in. So to get us started, you walk into your classroom and you can just feel something's not quite right. There's something going on, the students are on edge. What do you do?
And whoever wants to jump in, we'll let you all go organically. Well, one of you got to jump in. Josh, go ahead.
All right. So the topic, obviously the topic can mean different things to different people, but the topic can be, let's just say the topic can be very divisive and contentious. And I mean, some of it depends on what you're teaching, but can you relate the topic to your class in a meaningful academic way? And if not, perhaps I would recommend that perhaps the best course of action is to say to the students, I have office hours and I'm on campus quite a bit, and I would be open to discussion with this outside of the classroom.
I think that's great. I think we all hopefully, take advantage of outside of classroom hours to support classroom learning. I would just also say, and I think this is going to come up a lot in our discussion, that these are the types of things that become easier to handle with experience. So there are certain times of year where we may feel something is amiss because there's a huge assignment due in some other class that our students are taking. And so I just add to this that just have faith that experience can help, but also that we can do some investigation outside of class through our research assistants, through the Dean of Academic Affairs and other folks, colleagues, to figure out what external sort of influences might affect the classroom learning in a way that don't take away from our own time trying to investigate during class.
I would just add, Sonia, that I actually this may be the minority view, but I actually just go on with the lesson plan as usual. And the reason is because we are at the law school at the end of the day is a vocational school. As a lawyer, there will be a lot of things that happen in your life or in the lives of the law firm or the government agency, and you have a client, you have a very busy schedule to handle. And also the second thing is I feel very sort of anxious about getting through material that is extremely difficult. The First Amendment is, in my opinion, the most difficult area to teach in constitutional law. Profoundly difficult, in my view, for students to understand. There's so many different things for them to understand. And it's not just knowledge. It's the technique that's necessary to solve these different problems that I have to teach them, the techniques, and then we have to practice the techniques. And I understand there could be something amiss at the school, but if we talk about that, that's one less lesson plan that's now been canceled. And we're never going to get that back now. And again, as a matter of professionalism, I just pretty much march through, unless it's something just absolutely must be addressed.
John, listen, colleagues, there are no minority views here. We want you all to be doing something different in the room. So I love it. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Now, you actually are aware that there's a major incident. You're aware of the topic and you believe it to be on the minds of many of your students. Are you going to bring it up? Are you going to address it? Or are you going to, what is your plans, colleagues? What might you do? I guess I'll call you. John, what are you going to do? You know what the incident is. Are you bringing it up?
No, not really, for the same reasons as above. The only time something like that can come up is if we're covering clear and present danger under the First Amendment, and then President Trump might have said something that some people construe as creating a clear and present danger. That's useful fodder for my class. I can use that. It's like a gift. It's like a First Amendment gift from the gods. So I can use that without having to exercise my little brain to come up with a hypothetical. But other than something like that, again, it's one less day I have now to teach them the techniques and the rigor that's necessary for them to do their jobs as lawyers. It's just been spent doing something else. So I actually don't do that, and I don't encourage that type of behavior by the students because, as a matter of professionalism, that's just part of being like a lawyer. Something will always come up and prove distracting.
That's good. And we don't all get the fun of a hot topic in the news to add into class. But Maryam, what are you feeling?
I was just going to add, I think, again, this idea of utilizing outside of classroom space to address things. And I think, although I'm attracted by a lot of what John's saying, I also know that that people don't learn if they're really distracted, right? They can't they just literally can't focus. So there are some times when I feel it's important to address something, but I will try to do it outside of class. So what I might say is, anyone who wants to talk about this latest comment from President Trump who would like to stay after class and try to figure out how that relates to our content, you're welcome to stay. Or I've organized pop-up, brown bag lunches in the forum, or extra office hours sometimes. And I'll just tell them, I know there's some stuff going on that relates to what we're teaching. If you'd like to be in solid, or just be in a space to talk about those things, we can create those spaces. But again, to stay away from taking away class time in required courses.
Josh, any thoughts? Now, it doesn't have to even be something within your curriculum or specifically, but what are you going to do about that topic that
I mean, occasionally teaching criminal law or constitutional law, something is going on in the real world, which applies to the class. But I've learned over time to not include it too much into the active classroom. And a classic example is my criminal procedure students want to talk about the pending trial against Alec Baldwin. And I might mention how the charges are constructed and talk about that, but in terms of spending much time on it, I won't. I certainly would do it after class, and I've given media interviews, but I don't for the same purpose that John has said, which is we're trying to teach principles of constitutional criminal law to a future group of practitioners of it, and you can't really learn through a celebrity trial. Or I learned the hard way once when one of our not so distinguished law school alumnus was disbarred and I was teaching ethics. It was sort of natural to go and explain that to the students, but we're in a small community and some of those students may be friends with that individual, or it may cause feelings. So I've sort of learned over time to just, especially the localized events, to try to stay away from them.
And for our colleagues that have joined us, remember, we're law professors, so we're used to talking about the live thing. So we're going to try and stay away from too many real examples, colleagues, and we'll stick to the topic. Julia, any ideas? Well, how else can this date evolve?
So what if a student comes up to you before class and says, this is we're all just really worried about this. Can you talk about it?
This exact situation, has come up, especially in constitutional rights with the current court that we have. There are cases that are decided that students have immediate opinions about. And again, what I have tried to do is because we are those of us in this room, at least Josh, John, Sonia, and I are. We are also teaching them to think critically, to disagree with one another. That they're going to have to convince people who vehemently disagree with them to be on their side. They're going to have to educate their clients who may not be aware of sensitive, facts, and convince them to make decisions in their own best interests. And so what I would say to that student is, I hear what you're saying. I will think about how and whether there's a way to incorporate into the class, but if not, there are these other ways that we can, explore what it is that you're concerned about. You as a student can organize a lunchtime discussion, which I would be happy to support. Or, again, these office hours and other kinds of gatherings.
John?
Yeah, in my experience teaching at UNM, the students are excellent students and I appreciate them very much. But the only time there's been like tension in the room, in my experience, has not been because of some political event. It's because they have a writing assignment due in a different class in 3 days. And they're very anxious. They're not paying attention to anything that I'm saying. They have not slept in about 2 days. They're very stressed out. They have done none of the readings which I assigned. And at that point, it's not a problem of like controversy, but I need to get their attention. I also need to remind them that part of being a good professional is keeping up with all of your homework. You can't tell if there's 2 partners for whom you are working with in a law firm. You can't tell partner number 2, I'm sorry, I'm working for partner number 1. I'm going to ignore you for the next couple of days. That is not the right answer. But that's the main sort of like tension I feel in the class, is when obviously I can see in their eyes they have not slept. They're completely fixated on finishing a legal writing problem for a different class, and they're not paying attention to what I'm saying. So for that, I just plow through. There's nothing I can do. I try to make the class more interesting, but there's nothing more I can do really in those circumstances.
Josh?
Well, if a student were to come to me before class, and I think it happened more in the prior presidential term than it's happened recently, and having a concern and wanting to talk about something, if it were related to the topic in the class, I would say my answer to them is I would be happy to talk about it over lunchtime and do what Maryam has suggested doing, which is brown bag lunching. So, you know, when you teach criminal law, there are all sorts of topics that you end up teaching. And typically in teaching in an area like sexual assault, you have the Harvey Weinstein trial out there. I mean, students are curious as to your thoughts about it because you're teaching the subject matter. It's a very difficult subject to teach. But in the real world cases that go on, and sometimes they evoke strong emotions, and understandably so, I generally defer for lunchtime discussions on those and not bring them into the classroom, because law, like physics, in a way, there are principles that the students have to be taught and learn how to use those principles against other facts that are introduced. And so I don't want to take away from that.
Now, this happened to me, and maybe it's happened to many of our colleagues listening, but you can tell something is going on and you're not aware of anything. The room is divided, just as John said, and they're tense about something, and it's impacting the learning experience. Or a student actually raises their hand and say, I've got an opinion on topic. And a student counters and says, I have a counter opinion on topic. What do you do when they bring it into your room? And you all can take any one of those points. But Josh, student raises their hand and says, I have an opinion on topic. And student counters, I have a counter opinion. What do you do?
Well, this has actually happened before, in particular when I teach sexual assault, because there are interesting defenses out there that defendants have and the like, without going into detail, defendants constitutionally have, and sometimes that evokes a fight among the students. However, what I've done at the very beginning of the semester in my syllabus and in my introduction to the students is talk about respect for each other and what that means, and how stereotyping and how bigotry is not tolerated in the class. And I have, at least on one occasion that I can immediately recall, explained that to the students in that point. Now, if it's an area outside of the subject matter and you've got a fight coming in or something between students in the classroom, you tell the students, I've brought students in and I've asked them, do you really want to be a lawyer, a law student? Don't ever do that again in a classroom. I mean, I have been very blunt with students before on that, when it's a personality or a political argument that has nothing to do with what the subject is in the school.
Thanks for that. I mean, John, how do you address it? I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, Sonia, I really don't have those issues ever come up in my class. And I think the reason is because I hog up all the time talking myself. And the reason is because I'll discuss the cases and then I'll say, did you see all the problems and the way the judge wrote the opinion? And do you see the pattern that this guy has over the course of a decade? Did you see the pattern over the course of a decade? And I'll point it out. He keeps on doing the same thing over and over again. It makes no sense. And they didn't see that. And I say, watch for that, because that's like a habit that 3 of these people keep doing on the court. And it makes absolutely no sense. This is not a political statement. It's a lack of rigor on the court. And they're being very manipulative with regard to how they're reading the precedent. So I spend a lot of the time talking about, like, when you read the cases, try to think about the cases in the following way and be critical in this way. I'm not sure if that's really the best pedagogy, because I think that my colleagues give more room for the students to talk with each other. One thing that makes me nervous about doing that is I actually have a PhD in political science, by the way. So my background is actually as a political theorist, not as a lawyer. So in like a political theory class, that can be kind of interesting, but in a law class, it's like it's like being a plumber.
Not quite. Well, go ahead.
Like being a plumber or a car mechanic, in the following sense that when the students start talking a lot, I get worried thinking that, are you really sure you understand the cases? Because I want you to have an opinion, but I'm getting the feeling that I'm not sure if you really understand the cases. Not as a political matter, but I want you to know the skills. So I actually, I don't know whether there's good pedagogy, but I do hog up a lot of the time. Going through the methodologies and teaching them how to do that. And then we use their opportunity to participate is in the hypotheticals that I give them ahead of time.
Mhm.
Take home, and then we'll talk about the hypothetical and how to justify your conclusion. That's when they can participate.
Now, John, what I really do like is that you basically get them so excited about the curriculum, they can forget about the topic because now they're just caught into this thread of watching the judges and they can have a moment to forget the topic a little bit. Maryam, what are your thoughts? That counter back and forth happens in your class live.
Yeah, it has, and I'm really grateful to say that, you know, for after years of you know, working in DC and with amazing mentors and having watched political discussions and legal discussions with people who very much disagree on topics, I feel very well equipped to facilitate dialogues when students disagree. You know, and I know that can be hard for some of us. It feels overwhelming. It feels like, you know, we don't want it to get out of control. But you know, having lived through that, I have developed you know, some confidence with. So I actually, you know, while I don't want to go off topic, I also don't want to create an environment in which students don't feel free to participate. And so it's a delicate balance. How do you do that? Sometimes it involves later on having to go in and say something to clean things up, right? We took some time on this topic. I prefer that we do that outside of class next time. You know, we don't have to get it right every time, all the time. We can always go back. We can send emails following up to just say, you know, this is what happened today, but here's what I'd like to see in the future, et cetera.
Maryam,
I was going to say, I just love that idea that, I guess we'll just clean it up next time. We can't. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
well, okay, so I think that's great. And there's a lot of things that are being said that translate to classes on main campus. So I hope people are listening for the key parts here. So Maryam, that's a great segue into, okay, your day is about to get a lot worse. You made an offhand comment about the topic in class. Maybe it was meant to be funny. Maybe it was just an offhand comment, and it did not go well. What are you going to do now?
Well, I've heard, you know, the dean of a law school, I was doing reference checks for our hiring committee, and the dean of a law school was talking about in you know, singing the praises of an applicant, the importance of vulnerability and how vulnerability is actually a strength as a teacher. And it got me thinking about the importance of us, you know, admitting when we're wrong sometimes, or admitting that we would handle something a little bit differently the next time around. And again, if we're modeling that for our students who are going to get it wrong, I mean, they're not perfect. They're never going to be perfect plumbers who, you know, do the right maneuver and fix the right part the first time around. That we can model for them that, you know, I've given some more thought to this situation or this comment that I made, and I think I would handle it differently the next time. I think it's okay to be vulnerable.
Josh?
I mean,
Sorry. Go ahead, John.
yeah, I say things that I regret all the time in class. Not to be funny, I actually did win the Humorous Idol Award one time. This is the award the law school gives for most humorous professor. I was shocked to receive that because I actually I don't try to be funny in class. I don't view myself as a particularly humorous person in general. So I was shocked to get it. But the mistakes I made are not with humor. The mistakes I made are with like if a student comes late, sometimes I'll get annoyed and I'll say, well, nice of the students to join us today, but in like a kind of a biting way. And I usually don't apologize for that because it teaches them not to be late anymore. So I actually don't apologize. But there are some times where like I do get annoyed by students who are like super late all the time. And there have been 2 times, I believe, in 5 years where I did call out a student individually saying, you're always late. And the tone that I said, it was not professional. It was not insulting or offensive, but I was annoyed, and you can hear that my volume go up when I said that. And then I apologized to the entire class the next day.
I would say this about apologizing and sincerity. And my biggest fault, I have had students say to me, hey, you teach criminal law right after lunch. When you give your own experiences as a prosecutor, sometimes they're kind of graphic. But the big faux pas I pulled was I'm an avid runner. I was training to run a marathon to qualify for the Boston Marathon. I didn't. I walked in as an adjunct professor into a class I was teaching at Johns Hopkins, having no idea about the Boston Marathon bombing because I had worked at the NSA at the time, and you don't see the light of day at the National Security Agency. So I rushed over to Hopkins. I was listening to music to clear my mind, going to teach my adjuncting course, and the student said to me, "Oh, you must be happy you didn't qualify for the Boston Marathon." And I looked at him and I said, "It's no big deal. I'll try to get it next year." And the way I said it must have appeared so flippant that students were appalled. I went out, I learned what had happened, and I was emphatically apologetic to the students. I don't know if they all believed me because every radio and television station had it on. I just didn't know. But I did spend the next week or so apologizing to these PhD level students in Baltimore for making a flippant comment without realizing.
Now, it's one thing when it's just in your class and you can apologize there. What do you do, colleagues, if the students recorded you and it makes its way to your chair, your colleagues, the local media, social media? What do you do when it's not quite just contained in that smaller space? John, what would you do?
Yeah, I actually record every single one of my lectures and they're available online. So I don't know what people do with them. I'm sure I say things that are kind of like nutty and probably borderline stupid every once in a while. And yeah, I don't really worry about that going up because I don't think anyone pays attention to what I do. So I don't really worry about that all that much. But I think that's where this idea of academic freedom comes in. That the freedom that you have is not to go on tangents. And all of us do, I certainly do. But the freedom is to convey the expertise in your brain and to convey that to your students. And that's how you want to convey what's in here to over there. That's, if you focus on that, I think it can alleviate a lot of the problems. I saw some of the questions in the chat over here. And it seems like, again, like what some professors are doing is they're really broadening this idea of academic freedom and merging with the First Amendment right of speech. That instead of thinking about academic freedom as your vocational right in here, conveying it out there, they're thinking about like, what about in my heart and expressing my ideas about the world with the rest of the students. Those students are a captive audience. You're holding them like kind of like hostages in your class that they cannot leave. And sometimes this causes professors to think that maybe since they can't leave, I'm just gonna like tell them. They confuse a kind of like captivity with a kind of like deference, which is not the same thing. Those students are there because they have no choice, not because they're here to like hear your wisdom. They can't leave. You're holding them hostage in a sense. And I think they sort of like get the sense that now I'm gonna like share my views of the world with them. And I think that's where some of the trouble can come in. But as long as they adhere to academic freedom, Sonia, I think this idea of recordings going out into the world, you're more likely to avoid problems like that.
We do tend to think about that in the legal space. Anything you say can and will be held against you everywhere. Josh, what do you do? Your words get out of your space, and we're running short on time. But what would you do?
Yeah, well, I think John has a great idea, which is record yourself, because at least what you say is in context if anyone challenges you, as opposed to, something that shows up on
That's good.
some, fringe type internet media source, which is only because we see that. What do? I have my notes, I have my slides, I try to explain the context in which I made the comment on to the best of my recollection. And, I try to prepare not to say things that are they may be controversial, but not in a manner, always check yourself before you go in, but not in a manner that's going to cause controversy outside of the controversy. And to just preface whatever you say with, look, there are other opinions on this subject.
Thank you. Maryam? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, Maryam, what are you thinking?
Yeah, and no, I think this is everyone's fear, including our students. I think they have a real fear of being canceled, and so I try to just say that out loud. We all have this fear, and it's I hope that we can all respect one another, that if we disagree with something that someone else says or an approach that I take or that a colleague takes, that we can talk to each other about it and not make it a public issue. I try to really especially in constitutional rights, this the course that John and I both teach, which covers the First Amendment. That's a course where I try to make sure, to make that statement. And thankfully, knock on wood, haven't had any issues yet.
Thank you. Julia, what are you thinking?
So I think this has provided some good opportunities for everyone to think about how they approach their classes. I apologize we can't get to all the questions. We'll make sure and capture them and see if we can post something on the Advanced Academic Freedom website. I want to give all of our speakers a chance to offer any last minute thoughts. I'll start with Sever to see if he wants to add anything now that he's heard some other perspectives.
I thought all the contributions were great. I'm not in the classroom as you all are, so I really appreciated the wisdom and the insights. Thank you.
Josh, last minute thoughts?
Yeah, I'll join with what Sever said about appreciating everybody else's insight, and it's an honor to be here. But I think I would leave this one idea about academic freedom out there, and it's a mirror of what John Kang has said. It is not the same thing as the First Amendment. There are similarities, but you perhaps should confine your academic freedom to the principle that you hold a position of public trust. And that's been watered down all over the country, if not the world, what that means, but it still does mean something. And I would just say that should be your guidepost.
Thank you. John?
Oh yeah, this is slightly different off topic, but if there's any folks out there who are watching this and you want to connect with me in the law school, just look me up on the website, and I'd be really excited to meet you, because I actually don't know that many people on the main campus. We're kind of physically removed from the main campus, so contact me. I'd love to connect with you.
Great, thank you very much. Maryam?
Thank you. I'll just echo what John just said and just say I'm really grateful we're having this conversation, and I'd love to see more conversations like this about academic freedom and First Amendment and how to give our students space, but also, give ourselves the ability to teach our expertise in the ways in which we think, make sense.
Sonia?
I was going to quote my mentor who's on the Zoom, Marcia K. Hardiman at Africana Studies, and she taught me this principle that I try to remember. They will listen if they know you care. And I really try to give myself grace. I try to give my students grace, my colleagues, because we're trying to do a really complex thing. And this public trust I take very seriously. So I'm really trying to guide myself on that idea.
So I want to thank all of the panelists for making the time. I do hope this is the start of additional conversations on campus. We do have an in-person workshop coming up Friday, March 29th, on talking across differences and creating conditions for productive dialogue, which I think will be a very nice follow-on to this conversation. We will be posting this, and I really appreciate everyone, and I will echo, let's give our students and ourselves as much grace as possible in these very challenging times. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everyone.